I used to believe my life truly began the day I got married. Everything seemed to align: love, stability, peace. My husband, Arjun, is everything I ever hoped for in a partner: kind, loyal, present. We share quiet mornings, evening walks, and inside jokes that only make sense to us. But even in this beautiful life, there's a chapter I've never spoken of. A part of me that's tucked away in silence. I thought it would stay buried. But one evening, while clearing out old files on an aging laptop, I stumbled across an email, one I hadn't seen in years. Just a name in the subject line: Arav. My breath caught. Time stopped for a moment. That name held 1,000 memories I had sealed away. The past came rushing in uninvited. I remembered being 23, fresh out of college, full of dreams but unsure about everything else. Life felt overwhelming. I was dating someone back then, Ritesh. He was decent, safe, but distant. Our relationship was functional, nothing more. Somewhere in that space of emotional neglect, I met Arav. He was a friend of a friend, someone who stood out in every room without trying. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words lingered. We bumped into each other often: bookstores, cafes, weekend hangouts. Slowly, something grew between us. At first, it was lighthearted, a casual friendship that neither of us questioned. But it didn't stay casual for long. I started looking forward to his texts, his late-night calls that stretched for hours, the way he listened like I was the only person in the world who mattered. I told myself it was harmless. I was in a relationship, but that bond had faded. Arav made me feel alive, seen, and most dangerously understood. I began lying to Ritesh, to my friends, and most of all, to myself. I said I was working late, meeting girlfriends, running errands. All the while, I was slipping further into something I couldn't name. One evening, Arav and I sat on a quiet rooftop after a long walk. The city buzzed below us, but we were wrapped in silence. He reached for my hand, and I didn't pull away. That moment wasn't loud or dramatic. It was soft, simple, and entirely wrong. I knew it, and yet I let it happen. That night, nothing physical happened. But emotionally, I had crossed a line. I went home that evening with a storm inside me. I looked at Ritesh and felt nothing but guilt. I didn't know how to end it with him, and I didn't know how to define what was growing between me and Arav. That was the beginning of the chapter one never thought I'd revisit. A chapter one thought had been erased by time. But memory has a cruel way of bringing back the things we try hardest to forget. And I was just starting to remember it all. Arav and I became inseparable in ways I hadn't planned. It started with daily texts, then turned into long conversations about life, pain, dreams, things I never talked about with Ritesh. Arav listened without judgment. He had this calm way of making me feel like I mattered, like every word I said was worth something. I was drawn to that, maybe too much. I began craving his presence more than I cared to admit. The more I saw him, the more distant I grew from Ritesh. I wasn't honest with either of them. I told myself I hadn't done anything wrong, that emotional connections didn't count. But deep down, I knew what I was doing. It became harder to keep up the lie. I wasn't where I said I was. I wasn't who I used to be. Arav made me feel things I hadn't felt in years: excitement, connection, desire. It wasn't just about attention, it was about feeling known. He asked me questions no one else did. He remembered little things, followed up on my worries, supported my ambitions. I caught myself smiling at my phone like a teenager. I'd stay up late just to hear his voice one more time. The thrill of it was addictive. Still, I told myself there was a line I hadn't crossed. I hadn't cheated. I hadn't said the words out loud. But every moment I spent with Arav was a step further away from who I used to be. One evening, I realized I was no longer trying to save my relationship with Ritesh. I was simply pretending. I stopped initiating conversations. I stopped caring whether we fixed things. Arav had become the emotional center of my life. I waited for his calls. I replayed his words in my mind. When I got good news at work, he was the first person I wanted to tell. I knew then that I was in deep. The lines had blurred. I wasn't being faithful, not emotionally, not mentally. My loyalty had shifted, And that's something Ritesh never even saw coming. Arav never pressured me. He never made promises. But he knew exactly what was happening. There were moments, glances, pauses, words left unsaid, that carried more weight than anything physical. We danced around the truth, both aware of what this had become but unwilling to name it. I wanted to believe it was love. I needed to. Otherwise, everything I was doing would just feel like betrayal. I clung to the fantasy that Arav was different, that maybe this was fate, that perhaps I had met the right person at the wrong time. I began imagining a future where he was mine. The guilt would come in waves, but I'd push it away. I told myself Ritesh never really saw me anyway, that he wouldn't even notice if I was gone. Arav had become my escape, my secret world, and I wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. Even if I knew it couldn't last, I wanted to believe it could. I had already fallen. There was no turning back. It didn't unravel all at once. It started with delayed replies, missed calls, excuses that didn't add up. Arav, once so present, began to drift. I noticed it but chose denial. I asked fewer questions, afraid of the answers. Still, a part of me knew something had shifted. The warmth in his voice was replaced with indifference. The attentiveness was gone. I told myself he was just busy. But the silence spoke louder than his words ever did. Then it happened. A friend of mine, unaware of anything between us, casually mentioned Arav's engagement. My heart stopped. She had seen a post, congratulatory comments, tagged photos. I didn't believe her at first. I searched for proof and found it within seconds. There he was, arm around another woman, smiling like nothing else existed. They looked happy, engaged, public. My world didn't just shake, it collapsed. I confronted him, not with anger, but confusion. He didn't deny it. In fact, he barely flinched. His words were calm, detached. He said he cared about me but never promised anything. Said I knew what this was. That he had a life I was never going to be part of. I stood there listening as the person I thought I loved reduced everything between us to a passing phase. He wasn't cruel. He didn't need to be. His indifference was enough. I left without another word. What followed wasn't just heartbreak. It was shame. I had risked everything for a fantasy. I had cheated on someone who, while flawed, never betrayed me. I had let myself be used. And I had no one to blame but myself. I stopped seeing friends. I ignored calls. I cried in silence, not because of Arav, but because I couldn't recognize who I had become. I avoided mirrors, conversations, anything that reminded me of the choices I had made. Ritesh didn't know the full story. He just knew something had been broken between us. I ended things with him quietly, citing confusion and the need for space. He didn't fight me on it. Maybe he'd known for a while. Maybe he was relieved. Either way, it was over. I walked away from that relationship carrying more guilt than heartbreak. It wasn't just about what I did. It was about who I allowed myself to be with someone like Arav. I spent months in silence. I didn't date. I didn't flirt. I didn't trust my own judgment. I buried the memories and told myself it was a lesson. But deep down, I didn't feel wiser, just damaged. I built walls so high that no one could get through. I promised myself that I would never again confuse attention for love, desire for devotion. That chapter was over. But it left behind pieces of me I'm not sure I'll ever fully get back. And for the first time, I understood how betrayal can live quietly in a person long after the story ends. Years passed. I rebuilt, slowly and silently. I moved cities, changed jobs, cut ties with anyone who might bring up the past. I kept my head down and my heart guarded. Love was something I no longer chased. I focused on stability, routine, discipline, emotional distance. Then I met Arjun. He wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. He was calm, consistent, and kind. There was no spark that set my world on fire, just a steady warmth that refused to fade. He didn't ask too many questions, didn't dig into my past. He just saw me as I was, wounded but honest. For the first time, I felt safe. I didn't tell him about Arav. I didn't tell him about Ritesh. I gave him only what I thought he needed to know. I convinced myself that those truths were irrelevant now, buried with the version of me that no longer existed. We got married a year after we met. It was simple, beautiful, and right. Arjun treated me with a tenderness I hadn't known before, and I gave him everything I had left. I promised myself I'd never look back, that there would be no more secrets, but that was a lie too, because there was still one I hadn't faced. Finding that old email from Arav shook something in me. I didn't open it, I couldn't. Just seeing his name after all those years made my stomach turn. I stared at it, heart pounding, wondering what I would find if I read it. An apology? A confession? Or worse? Nothing that made it feel worth the pain? I deleted it. I didn't read a word. Because I realized something in that moment. I didn't need closure from him. What I needed was forgiveness from myself. I had spent years carrying guilt like it was punishment, believing I deserved heartbreak because of the choices I made. But the truth is, I was young, lost, and desperate for something I couldn't name. That doesn't excuse what I did, but it explains it. I can't undo the damage. I can't rewrite that chapter. But I don't have to let it define everyone that follows. Betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, buried in decisions that feel small until they unravel everything. And healing isn't instant. It's a long, brutal process of learning how to trust again, mostly in yourself. Arjun doesn't know the full story. Maybe one day he will. Maybe he won't have to. What matters is that I've never given him a reason to doubt me. I've loved him with a depth I didn't know I was capable of. Because of what I lost, I now know how to hold on. Not desperately, but deliberately. The past didn't disappear. It just stopped controlling me. That hidden chapter will always be a part of my story, but it no longer defines it. I closed it without bitterness, without nostalgia, and without looking back. Sometimes the truest love story begins after the hardest lessons. And this time, I'm choosing honesty, even if the truth lives only inside me.